Alxa's total area is actually larger than Zhejiang province, but it only has less than 300,000 people. China's largest deserts are all there. I grew up there myself, so I'm actually a very typical small-town test taker. Back then, I ordered a book by mail called something like Waiting for You at Peking University. I went up to our high mountains and looked out, and then I thought, maybe I could make this my goal. And a year later, a miracle really did happen. I remember it was also in 2013. One day, Mr. Richard Liu called me and said,
Hey, you're a good young man.
Hey, do you want to come and join us? I said at the time, well, I only know how to do investment. I thought, you're still burning money, where's the money for investment? You have to believe in your choices and dare to look at goals that you once thought were completely out of reach. Actually, later when I did venture capital, I witnessed such miracles again. Today, every consumption and every new thing is relative to its era. It's relative to the infrastructure of that era and relative to that group of people. When Ms. Cathy Zhu entered the industry in 1990s, the new consumption she invested in was called Wahaha.
My saying is, every generation has its brands. I think what you're actually saying is every generation has its retail. But in the end, we'll all meet, because brands can't exist without retail, and retail can't exist without brands. Hello everyone, welcome to Gentle Sharp. I'm Doris. For today's episode, I really want to call it a mid-mountain rendezvous. Actually, at the summit, I said that I met several mentors in 2025, like Mr. Kong Longfeng and Mr. Robert Chang. Whenever I meet someone who helps me a lot, I really want to introduce them to everyone to help more people. So earlier, we invited my big brother, Kong Longfeng, and we became sworn brothers later. This time, we've invited another big brother, though we haven't sworn brotherhood yet, and Mr. Robert Chang. Mr. Chang actually listened to one of my podcasts called 2 Hours to Understand Branding and Marketing, and he came all the way to my office to talk to me for 2 hours about marketing and consumption. And then he said he saw the entire logic of retail in a pair of underwear. I thought that was very interesting. Why do we call it a mid-mountain rendezvous? Because I feel he came up from the bottom of the mountain and I'm going down from the top. He really understands the supply chain, understands channels and retail, and sees many essential things. That is, he understands the supply chain, categories, and industrial efficiency of the era where things of a kind flock together. Since I'm someone who rose during the era of new consumption and content e-commerce, I better understand the generation where people are divided by groups who understand users, content, and emotional value. So while we're both making up for our own shortcomings, we met halfway up the mountain. So for this episode, I really hope Mr. Chang can tell us about his past, including his start at JD and his time at Capital Today and later founding GenBridge's Capital. I think Mr. Chang is the most authentic, pragmatic, and down-to-earth investor I've ever met. Because in 1920, when I first started Digipont, many consumption investors were at the door saying, we were supposed to work together, but after a few years, they all disappeared and went to invest in AI and technology. I think it's really not easy to keep investing in the consumer sector, so I really wanted everyone to meet my mentor, Mr. Robert Chang. Would you like to say hello to everyone?
Hello everyone, I'm Robert Chang. I'm very happy to be on Doris's podcast. To briefly introduce myself, I've been in consumer investment for 20 years and have witnessed 2 generational shifts in China's consumer market. I'm also an entrepreneur. 10 years ago, we founded GenBridge's Capital. At that time, with a passion very similar to Doris's, we set our mission to help build China's next generation of consumer champions, and we've been doing this for 10 years now. In recent years, I've been very lucky that 20 or 30 founders have allowed us to accompany them as they grow. The thing that makes me happiest now is often when I run into friends who tell me, oh, it turns out the Shiyu Daoqian rice my family often eats, the ripe fruit drinks I have, the forest cabin and dream garden products we use, and even the Yeswood furniture in our home. When I go out shopping, your M-Stand coffee, Shueiji snacks, Himo, and Luxi, they're all related to you. When people mention it like that, I feel really happy. It's actually been an opportunity to accompany so many special founders and the growth of these brands. At the same time, I'm a fan of your podcast, Doris. We carefully read every article and listen to every podcast, and we've gained a lot of strength from them.
Mr. Chang is truly a big fan of mine. I think it's a great honor for us to have you listening to us all the time. Because I've actually listened to your interviews and podcasts with everyone else, and I've noticed that you really like to talk about 2 brands. One is Shiyue Daotian, as you mentioned. But you've invested in so many brands. Why do you like talking about Shiyue Daotian so much? Did something about it really strike a chord with you?
Yes, that's true. Actually, everyone remembers that during the peak from 2019 to 2020, people were talking about many new brands. In 2020, we were very fortunate to come across a brand that sells rice by chance. Because as you just said, at that time, we all felt there were opportunities in China's new consumer market, thinking that every category could have a new brand. Many consumer founders and investors searched through every category, but I believe few people probably looked into this one. When we were looking at JD.com's categories, the fastest growing one was rice. Then I saw that in this category, I was very familiar with the second and third places, Arowana and Fortune, which are huge companies. But the first place was Shiyue Daotian, and the fourth place was actually Chaihuo Dayuan. I was quite surprised to see new brands in such a category. I asked my wife if she knew the brand, and she told me our family had been eating it for several years. Then I asked JD.com if they'd noticed it, and they said they knew it was doing well, but they hadn't really met the founders. But when we actually found them and heard their entrepreneurial story, and after we invested in them in 2020, the company has grown to 7 billion in revenue today and has become a great brand. The biggest impact this had on me was that back then we wanted to build next generation brands. And if we at GenBridge look back today and say, well, in the end, this new brand might just be selling rice, which I think will be quite surprising. It's precisely such an unexpected outcome that reflects the opportunities provided by the changes we've seen over the years. So I think Shiyue Daotian, in a category that's existed for 1,000 years, becoming number one in the mid to high-end market is very significant.
So how big was it when you invested?
At that time, they were doing about 1 billion in business a year, mostly on JD.com. So in 5 years, it's grown sevenfold. The key is that it's now the top brand for mid to high-end rice in China. In all the best channels people use now, it's number one online and number one offline too.
So my understanding is you love talking about this brand because it's so counterintuitive. I've been talking about new consumption since 2019, and we always think of the new generation of consumption as being about things like beauty products or tech, the trends everyone's talking about. But this category you're mentioning is actually the most practical, essential, and unchanging. Yet you've created a mid to high-end brand amidst all this change. It's very counterintuitive.
Yes, and that's what I think GenBridge has been doing these past few years. Along the way, many people have come and gone with the tides. They might chase the latest tech or AI, but we've stayed because we see many entrepreneurs achieving remarkable things and creating great brands in these fields. Not just that, but also companies we've invested in like Yeswood or Batare. In recent years, Dream Garden and Forest Cabin have all emerged from these categories. It's like how we used to think everyone loved the term top-down. We'd define a demographic first. I remember people saying, oh, fashionable women and moms have the highest value. And then there's children. We need health. And then wasn't there that saying, men are worth less than dogs?
Pets.
Right, pets. So many people invested in pet food, hospitals, toys, and water dispensers. But later I said we actually have many basic products that haven't been well noticed or addressed. So there really are many opportunities in every category. What also struck me was that back in 2020, during the first 6 months of the pandemic, besides Shiyue Daotian, we invested in another company called Yeswood. At that time, their annual revenue was about 1.5 billion. Quietly, by last year, the company's revenue reached 15 billion. That is to say, while the real estate market was down and all home-related categories were declining, they grew tenfold against the trend. And now, more and more people around me are saying, hey, I'm buying their stuff. In the past few years, when friends moved to places like Hong Kong or Singapore, they'd order furniture and have it shipped directly to Singapore. So I feel that seeing companies like these, they've quietly achieved some very proud results.
Actually, one thing I really admire about you, Mr. Chang, is your independent judgment. I feel like you always have your own anchor point. But what I'm most curious about is how a person's judgment and standards are shaped by their experiences. I know you grew up in Alxa, Inner Mongolia. So what was your childhood experience like?
Yes, I was born in Alxa, Inner Mongolia. It's one of the most remote places in Inner Mongolia. The total area of Alxa is actually larger than Zhejiang province. But even now, there are only about 300,000 people there because several of China's largest deserts are located there. So I grew up there until I left for college at 18. I was basically a typical small-town test taker. That's how I made my way out. So often when I think of that place, and now that I'm in the consumer industry, I feel like it's like a nerve ending of Chinese consumption. At most, it's a tier 5 city. For a long time, the work I did seemed to have nothing to do with the people back home, my family, or my former classmates who stayed there. But over the past few years, I've gradually seen changes. Maybe about 5 years ago, the first mixed-way Bing Cheng opened there, and then 2 or 3 more. Maybe 4 years ago, Guoquan opened. Then the year before last, we got our first KFC. Last year, Chegi arrived. Oh, and Luckin Coffee opened too. Now, I understand that the things we're doing today, the new consumption trends we're watching, have finally reached the nerve endings of a tier 5 city in China. We have a connection. When I went home 3 years ago, I was chatting with my uncle, who's in his 70s. He said, I recently found a recipe on Xiaohongshu to make lunch for my grandson. I was stunned. I used to think Xiaohongshu was only
Already reached your hometown?
used by sophisticated urban women, right? But it turns out, even in my hometown, today my parents went on a trip to Tianjin. A few days ago, I said, hey, let me tell you about Tianjin. My dad calmly told me, I've already checked everything on Xiaohongshu. I said, okay. So it gave me a perspective. This is also what we at GenBridge later saw as the vastness of China, that we can use consumption to connect everyone. It's actually a pretty great experience to be connected like that.
That's quite heartwarming. And hearing that, I want to ask, do your parents know what you're actually doing? Has no one ever asked you this question before?
Oh, they know. My whole family knows. Because for the things we've invested in, especially online products, we have all our relatives and friends use them. So they knew very early on, oh, they've invested in a lot of food and drink businesses.
So they think, my son is giving money to people who make food and drinks. Is that how they see it? Because my parents still have no idea what I do.
I think there's an advantage to consumer investment. If you do hard and core technology, it's very hardcore, right? But how do you show that to people? For example, when investors or others visit our office, I tell them, look, you can taste and experience everything we invest in. You can directly sense our taste and our results. So consumer investment is a very interesting experiment because you can let everyone.
It's closely related to people's livelihoods.
Yes, you can feel it. And everything we invest in is something people use. In fact, we use the products we invest in ourselves. It's a very rewarding experience.
Right? Remember when I went to your annual meeting? I mentioned chatting with Forest Cabin's founder, Mr. Sun Lichen, for a podcast. I kept asking him what his childhood was like. He said there was a stream by his door. Every time he thinks of Forest Cabin, he thinks of that spring and that stream. He said he wrote Make the Earth More Beautiful on paper. He wrote it 40 times in one go. And then he was moved to tears. I read that letter at your annual portfolio gathering. I was truly moved. Like Mr. Jin Chunwei said, we all come into this world with a certain will. So I've wanted to ask you this, and I've been waiting for today's podcast. I want to ask, when you think of your childhood, what kind of memories do you have?
If I were to talk about my own journey, growing up in Alxa really shaped who I am. It was a remote place, far from everything. Many things were scarce. Looking back now, there were things you could hardly even imagine. My early years were quite unique. I was in middle school, and since the principal was my uncle, he said, let's start a high school. So he decided to open one for the first time. When the high school opened, he kept us there, especially since we were relatives. There were no teachers. They were learning as they went. Some new graduates from Inner Mongolia Normal University also came. So everyone was figuring out how to run a high school from scratch. Our entire high school only ever had 2 classes. It feels a lot like starting a business today. You just have to dive in and do it. Both teachers and students were like guinea pigs. In my senior year, I switched from the science track to the liberal arts track. So that was quite different from things today, but it was a magical time. I remember ordering a book by mail back then. It was called Waiting for You at Peking University. I went up to the mountains to read it.
Waiting for You at Peking University?
Yes, it was a very chicken soup for the soul kind of book back then. I remember looking out from the high mountains and thinking, maybe I can make this my goal. A year later, a miracle really happened. In our area, over 20 or 30 years, maybe only 3 people ever made it to Peking or Tsinghua University.
Only 3 people in 20 or 30 years went to Peking University?
Yes. So at that point, I don't know how, but when you have a vision and start working toward it, magical things tend to happen. So I think that taught me one thing, to believe in your choices and dare to aim for goals that seem out of reach. Later, in my venture capital work, I witnessed such miracles again. To this day, I believe this mindset is perfect for investing, believing that beautiful and miraculous things can happen and are worth striving for.
I remember our previous podcasts were all about the success stories of consumer goods founders. Today, we're talking about the success story of a consumer investor and entrepreneur, which I find very interesting. You switched from science to liberal arts and got into Peking University.
It was like TNG's horse racing. Inner Mongolia's admission score was already low, and liberal arts competition was even lower.
You were quite strategic.
Exactly. An experience in college has continued for over 20 years until today, which is my connection with Chinese e-commerce. I think it's a very magical story. I was in college in 2000, which was actually a peak for the Chinese internet. At that time, everyone was working on things like China Ren. That shows my age. And also, back then, QQ and BBS were starting to appear, but there was actually a wave of e-commerce back then too. Nowadays, we think instant retail with 30-minute delivery is impressive. But back then, there was already a company called Ego 1 Hour. They claimed they could deliver in 1 hour. They seemed to be a startup related to Tsinghua University. So after you ordered, they would actually deliver it and they'd call you first. One night we ordered quite late and the person called to say, your dorm door must be locked by now, right? I remember my roommate said, it's fine. There's a window in the first floor washroom that's open. Please just climb in through there. So back then, Ego 1 Hour could deliver by coming through the washroom. Also, I took a course called International Trade back then. I still remember the teacher, Lee Kwan. I don't know why, but he actually gave me a whole class period to explain to everyone what e-commerce was. I remember using a projector in the multimedia classroom to talk about EachNet. I was like, look, this is a platform. Thinking back, I've been listening to Bo Xiao's podcast lately, and I remember explaining what EachNet was back then. Then I used Ego 1 Hour to explain what e-commerce was like. That was in 2000. Those companies were crazy. They delivered apples, curtains, everything to our dorm. They were burning money to deliver. Those were my earliest memories and impressions of Chinese e-commerce. Then, in 2006, in a small building outside the southwest gate of Peking University, I encountered a small company with only 100 people, making 100 million in revenue. But they were just selling 3C products, digital accessories.
Was it called JD?
At that time, it was called JD Multimedia.
Oh, really?
The domain name was 360by. That's when I met them. Mr. Liu said he originally started with counters at Dingao and Hailong near Peking University. Because of the SARS epidemic, he couldn't keep them open, so he eventually moved to selling things online. Later, that connection with JD led me to become an investor and help JD grow.
So how did you get involved with JD? What you just described sounds like a small convenience store, with someone named Richard Liu acting as the store manager.
By 2006, he had already started the website. Back then, there were 100 people and they could make 70 or 80 million a year. I was just a rookie who had just joined the investment world, and what was I sent to do? First, I had to call consumers. I remember making over 30 calls back then. Why are you willing to buy things from this place? People said back then, going to Hailong, you'd easily get scammed. You'd go in wanting one thing and come out with something else. The best thing about this place is that everything is genuine, so we feel safe. As for the inconveniences, there were many. For example, payment was hard and delivery took days, but people said they still trusted this website. That was the earliest days of JD.com, and I helped them grow along the way. JD.com was struggling in 2008. A year before their funding, no one wanted to invest in such a company, but they really pulled through. In 2013, I joined JD.com and started thinking from their perspective on how to become a bigger platform. That's when we realized, oh, JD.com, Tmall, and Alibaba are all so powerful and can sell so many things. At that time, we started thinking about something else. Since we're so strong online, should we transform the offline world? After doing strategic investment for JD.com, we invested in many offline businesses in China. You'll see that this thread has been developing for over 20 years. Starting from when I was in college and first understood e-commerce in China, then witnessing the early days and rise of one of China's major platforms. And later, when we were doing investments, we started GenBridge, and people talk about the new generation. Actually, it's simple. We wanted to find brands that could use new infrastructure to sell on JD.com and Tmall rather than starting offline. That's the new generation, and we look for them on these platforms. Today, you can see a group of companies that started on these e-commerce platforms. They've moved to multi-category and omni-channel. Now, people are gradually realizing, oh, these are China's new generation of brands.
Wait, I have a few questions for you because I'm quite interested in your background. First, why did you go straight into the investment department when you joined JD.com?
I studied economics in college. After graduating, I worked at an accounting firm. Then, by a stroke of luck, I met my greatest mentor, Kathy Xu from Capital Today. She gave me the opportunity to enter the field of investment. Kathy said, this project is quite new. Why don't you take a look? It was a coincidence because my experienced colleagues were all looking at bigger brands and more complex businesses. She told me to check this one out. That's how I got connected with JD.com. During that time, with a lot of passion, I helped JD.com with many things. Hiring, fundraising, many things were unclear, like how to manage and operate. During that process, I remember one day in 2013, Richard Liu called me and said,
Hey, you're a good young man.
hey, why don't you come and join us? At the time, I said I only knew how to do investment. I thought, you're still losing and burning money. Where's the money for investment? But he said, we've actually seen some future opportunities. Would you like to join us? So at that time, I think it was also a very coincidental opportunity. I thought, well, it's like I saw this company at its very beginning when it was still very small. I wanted to follow it and see where it goes. So in 2013, I made a rather unusual choice at the time, which was to join JD. And you might ask, what could I do at JD? Well, I just worked on strategy and investment.
Oh, but I remember there's a quite amazing story about you joining Capital Today, right?
Yes, that was also a time when entrepreneurship in China was really booming back in 2006. At that time, there was a show that was popular all over China called Win in China.
I remember that show.
That time really inspired everyone. Many people from that era, like Jack Ma, Liu Chuanji, and other entrepreneurs were there. There were also 3 venture capitalists I remember very clearly: Yan Yan, Hugo Shong, and Kathy Xu. They were explaining to everyone how venture capital views these things. After watching it, I thought, wow, this industry is incredible. It can turn stone into gold. So I later wrote letters to them. I found her email address online and sent one over. She called me back very quickly and said, do you want to come to Shanghai for a meeting?
What was in your letter? Something like, I'm a graduate of Peking University?
Not really. I just said that my main point was that I wanted to join this industry.
Oh.
Because at that time, when I went to headhunters wanting to enter this industry, they'd look at me and say, well, you know, the barrier to entry is very high. Why don't you go to the US for an MBA first and then come back for this? But only Kathy replied to me at the time saying, well, come over and let's meet. I remember it was on Huaihai Road in a tea house where I met the founders of Capital Today, who were also just starting out then. Later, I remember Kathy asking me, hey, what kind of business do you think is good? I said, well, I think, you know, I often eat at Zheng Kung Fu and it's quite good. What else? There were a few others. I just mentioned some names I'd observed. She said, okay, you can go back now. A few days later, Kathy called me and asked, would you like to join us? I thought, is it really this easy? She didn't seem to interview me much. I said, since such a great opportunity was given to me, I just packed a bag and came from Beijing. And just like that, I joined. They wanted me. So I asked why they wanted me. On my first day at the company meeting, there was an investment project list from that time, and I found that the one at the very top was Zheng Kung Fu. At that time, Capital Today's first investment project was Zheng Kung Fu, and then later it was JD.
Oh.
So I think it was really fate. At that time, I was just a fresh college graduate. What did I know? It was truly a mentor guiding the way and giving me a chance. I entered consumer investment quite blindly, and I've been doing it for 20 years now.
Wow, I'm so moved. Now, I know why we met in 2025. I also wrote letters back then. Don't they say Kathy Xu is incredibly accurate at judging people? Because I have an entrepreneur friend who said Kathy walked up, took one look at his partner, and said, you need to replace this partner. It's already been mythologized into stories like that. But she must have seen a lot in you. That unique power of conviction within.
We often call her Kathy, and Kathy is truly amazing. I just met Kathy in Hong Kong last week. She's been doing this for 30 years and is still full of passion. She's really witnessed several cycles and so many entrepreneurs. Her unparalleled curiosity and enthusiasm truly gave me a huge amount of energy in my early days.
Hey, I'd like to ask, back in college, you said your teacher, for some reason, gave you a whole hour of class time to give a lecture e-commerce. What did he see in you that made him inexplicably give you an hour to talk about that?
For instance, back then when we were in school, how far could we get in Alxa? It certainly wasn't as good as in the big cities, and I think it's the same at Peking University. With so many people, if we compared grades and everything, there'd definitely be many top talents, but I've always felt I have one trait, which is my curiosity. I'm quite willing to pay attention to and think about new things. At that time, I remember everyone was discussing these new things. It wasn't just e-commerce websites. I remember taking an insurance class back then and being assigned a project on a new generation of internet-based insurance companies. Later, I thought, oh, does this period just connect with everything that came after? So today, I've also made investing in finding and supporting the next generation of companies my career. This career is very much in line with my true self. It's the kind of thing that can satisfy my great curiosity and also let some very small companies witnessing them all the way, overcoming all kinds of difficulties to grow all the way, achieving something that people would have found unbelievable. Actually, this is a very big psychological satisfaction.
Wow, Mr. Chang, truly a hero from a young age. Actually, it was already very obvious when you were young. I think it's so interesting. Most people probably haven't heard these stories about Mr. Chang's past, right? Because his colleague is sitting next to him. He's probably thinking, oh, these cases again, I'm already very familiar with them. But when he was talking, he turned to look at him like this.
So those were the standard segments we usually tell on our own podcast, right? Only here with Doris.
I just like doing non-standard things, which is
like having an artistic life.
Artistic life. I actually know now why you're this kind of person. So how did you gradually come to understand the word consumption? Because actually, this word, whether you look at it broadly or narrowly, has different generational changes and several wave cycles. Have your understandings of consumption changed at each of these different stages?
Just like you said earlier, it seems that nowadays when we talk about consumption, it's seen as something very ordinary. When people see you doing consumer investment, even just mentioning these two words, it feels like doing something like tech investment or AI investment definitely sounds fancier. So when you talk about consumer investment, everyone tends to think it's relatively simple. Isn't it just that I spend money every day and that's consumption? But later on, I realized that there's actually a lot contained within such an everyday word as consumption, because the biggest thing about it is it's actually a process that never stops. Every single day, it's constantly changing. Sometimes at first, you might not feel much, but when you look back, you realize this is something that needs to be iterated on many times. So later, when we talked about new consumption, at that time, new consumption, if you look at it over a longer period, say 20 years, every generation has its own new consumption. Now, new consumption is happening every day. You might feel that what you're doing is very new, but in reality, every instance of consumption, every new, is only new relative to its own era, relative to the infrastructure of that time and to the people of that era. Back then, Mr. Shu entered the industry in the 1990s and invested in new consumption like Wahaha. Starting out, we saw snacks as a huge sector. We scouted stores like Artimart, where we found a brand called Amidst sunflower seeds. There was also a nut brand called Huawei Heng. I still remember what it looked like. Later on, a store opened in Shanghai where you could go in and pick out what you wanted, called Lai Yifen. Lai Yifen was the new consumption trend of that era, and many of us consumer investors went looking for it. At that time, the company was very picky. The investors, all of us were there, were each given half an hour to explain how we could be helpful to them. Lai Yifen was the top new consumption brand of that period, but were there any other options? I remember our colleagues went to Wuhan and found a company that had just opened a few dozen stores, very similar to Lai Yifen, called Bestore. Later, this company also became one that could generate 10 billion in revenue, and at its peak, it might have had 3,000 stores. But that wasn't the end of it. In 2013, Ms. Shu told me to go to Wuhu Anhui to check out a brand that had started selling nuts and roasted seeds online. That was when I first saw 3 squirrels at that time. I remember very clearly that in that year, their revenue was 30 million, and the following year, it exceeded 100 million. So later, we also invested in this company, and by 2019, it had reached 10 billion in revenue. In e-commerce, hitting 10 billion in revenue is remarkable. Reaching that in 2019 showed the market's power. Bestore also hit 10 billion, pivoting to premium snacks. Back then, one of my colleagues mentioned that in 2019, when we were shopping in Changsha, we saw a small shop on the street that had started selling these kinds of products in an open shelf format. By 2021, When we heard that this company was about to start a new round of financing, my colleague and I rushed to check it out. We hurried to hand over the money to them. It was Snack is Busy. They probably opened their first store in 2017. As you can see now, by last year, the entire Busy Ming group had opened 22,000 stores across China, generating about 100 billion in revenue. But that's not the end of the story. These are just the stores we often see on the streets or in our county towns today. If you walk into a shopping mall nowadays, you'll see another kind of store. It's called Shuiji Snacks, which offers fair prices and lets you taste before you buy. The store is bright and clean, and you can even watch them roast samples on site. Right next to it, there's another store selling taosu called Alxa. Later on, we invested in both of these companies. So if you look at the snack category alone over the past 20 years, there have already been several rounds of company iterations, but has this matter come to an end? No, it's far from over. Behind all this, in fact, China's commercial infrastructure has gone through generation after generation, starting offline, then moving online, and then returning again, back to offline. And in this process, when consumers are choosing a product like this, they've actually gone through a lot already. The changes in these choices, this category is actually a small microcosm, constantly iterating without pause.
Wow, what you just said was brilliant. It's always been snacks, but in fact, its changing forms have evolved along with the shifts in infrastructure and sales channels. So, how do you view each generation? What do they represent? Honestly, I feel like Bistor and Three Squirrels belong to the previous generation. They were always around when I was a kid. I have a stronger sense of connection with Snack is Busy. In your opinion, what are the core variable factors across these three generations?
One way to look at it is by seeing where they open their stores. The very first generation, they definitely started with offline locations. Today, we can use platforms like Tmall, JD.com, Pinduoduo, and Douyin and leverage the internet. But now there's also a return to offline channels. This is essentially about how to connect with consumers. It's a matter of distance. But behind this change in channels, there's actually an invisible shift that people don't easily notice. Namely, the reasons why consumers buy these products are changing. I remember very clearly that when people first started buying Three Squirrels, back then, Three Squirrels was considered cheap, but the products were definitely better than what you'd find in supermarkets. I remember when I visited Three Squirrels, their factory had something like a macadamia nut sorting basket. There was a sieve and the smaller ones would fall through first. For this kind of product, you'd probably first go to the wholesale market and then the ones in the middle would end up being sold at the supermarket. But the largest ones are the ones Three Squirrels selects. They want to sell those online. At the time, I asked them why they did this. They said, because I sell directly to consumers. If the quality isn't good, they'll complain about me. They'll leave me bad reviews. That was the first time I realized, oh, when you interact directly with consumers, you have to provide them with better products. This is a common trait shared by Three Squirrels and Bistor. They package the products themselves and use their own brand. They have already been strictly selected because I need to put my own logo on them. I remember back then, Laifen's preserved fruits and meat jerky, wow, at that time, the quality felt so high, almost unmatched. If you look at their financial reports, they had a 50% gross margin. So why did we later see brands like Snack is Busy? Visiting this store, we wondered why it was so cheap. How could they sell supermarket goods at 30 or 40% off? Nongfu Spring costs 2 yuan, but they charged 120 or 140. Many thought, you must be losing money at these prices. But when we asked, it turned out that the company was still making money. Not only that, the franchisees who opened these stores could recoup their investment in a year or a year and a half, and the company itself was still profitable. So we started to try to answer this question, how are they able to sell things like this? The products are cheaper, so why are they still making money? Then we found out that they only added a 30% gross margin. For example, at Bistor, they would usually double the price, but now they only add 30%, and yet both the franchisees and the company are making money. This kind of efficiency improvement made me tell my colleagues, hurry up, let's invest in this company right away. Over the past 2 years in our conversations with Snack is Busy, one thing has always stood out. They have remained relentlessly focused on doing one thing well. They said, I'm trying to find ways to further improve the quality inside. When it comes to Shuiji Snacks and Luxihi, they're even more particular because they want to set a price, and these products aren't packaged up. They want consumers to be able to see, touch, and smell them before finally tasting. So the quality has to be excellent. I think there's been a particularly big change in Chinese food. That is, products must keep getting better and better. Now, everyone checks the ingredient list, right? A clean ingredient list means our products are getting better and better.
That's really interesting. You can tell from these three major aspects, people, products, and places, that things are constantly changing, but at the core, it's always about improving efficiency. Actually, you can see this at JD.com as well. How did you come up with the idea to start your own business, to create your own brand, your own investment institution brand, and to have your own unique characteristics?
Yes, back when we were at JD.com, a lot of people would come to us. They'd say, hey, can we give you or JD.com some equity? But what they really wanted was just a bit of support from us, right? We were running a platform, so we couldn't just take people's equity. But later I started thinking, is it possible for us to set up a dedicated consumer fund to seek out this group of brands? At that time, we discovered something. Looking at the previous generation of these companies, you can see that for entrepreneurs, it really takes a long time, 20 or 30 years, to build up a business. This year is actually quite interesting. Both Pan Pan and Chia are celebrating their 30th anniversaries. You see, these are all brands we're very familiar with, which means they started their businesses around 30 years ago in the 1990s. If you think about it, that was also the time when China's large supermarkets and the entire deep distribution infrastructure were just getting started. Entrepreneurs of that generation, like Mengniu or the so-called four major brands, if you think about it, they all rose and developed alongside this foundational infrastructure as it was being built up. So back then we were thinking, today's infrastructure has become JD.com, Alibaba, and Tencent. So could it be that today brand companies like ours can start from here? We've seen a group of companies that have been able to reach 500 million or even 1 billion in revenue. They really were nobodies starting from scratch. Maybe they only spent 3 to 5 years, but they've already covered the ground that the previous generation took 10 years to accumulate. Is it possible that they could become the new champions of the next generation of consumer brands? So it was with this simple belief. So we also put this idea into our own name. We called ourselves GenBridge, meaning to inherit the past and usher in the future, to bridge the old and the new. In English, it's GenBridge, Generation Bridge. So from the very beginning, we believed that China would have a new generation of brands, and that's where we started our own entrepreneurial journey.
You know, when I founded Dalfa, my English name was Digipont, Digital Point. Point is actually bridge in French. We both had the same idea.
A bridge?
I thought every generation needs its own brands. You mean every generation needs its own retail, but we'll meet because brands and retail need each other. I've always wondered, why are brand businesses foreign owned? And why is the older generation still running things like in snacks? For example, my child just turned 5 recently, and then he said to me, Mum, I want to eat chocolate, ice cream, and Oreo. I thought, these are 3 imported categories. How did they manage that? He's only 5, and actually, since he was about 3, he started saying he liked eating ice cream, chocolate, and Oreo. Even Oreo is a brand name. Yes, he didn't even say he wanted preserved fruit or sunflower seeds, you know? That's what I wanted to say. How did these categories manage to enter children's lives so early? So did you ever have the same question? Why does it seem like there are no Chinese snack brands? There are only snack retailers, not actual brands.
When we started working in the consumer sector 20 years ago, there were already a lot of such questions. For example, at that time, Capital, today, my mentor, Ms. Xu, was observing why we were looking at Zheng Fu. Actually, the underlying question was, why doesn't China have a McDonald's? So at that time, a lot of people were asking this question. Fundamentally, why don't we have our own chain restaurants? Everyone was following this line of thinking. And there was another particular issue. China is a major tea-producing country. So why did Lipton manage to become a brand while China doesn't have its own tea brands? These questions all started from that time, but time always provides answers. Even now, China still doesn't have such a large tea brand. But as a major tea-producing country, we have contributed a super category to the world. It's called milk tea. So to come back to the point, demand is always there. The categories you just mentioned are actually the businesses that these companies are doing globally. They have developed the most outstanding best-selling single products through countless trials. That's why it has become popular all over the world. However, China is also a country with a large population and strong consumption power. In the beginning, we went through a period where we could use their brands together with the rest of the world. Today, it's our own time. All the things you have experienced, we will also have. I feel that in the past 20 years, a lot of investment and time has been spent on this. Now, we have all of it. For example, the reason we invested in Yeswood today is because 20 years ago, we might have still been studying. Back then, did we study IKEA? At that time, we also studied Uniqlo, so later we invested in Ludao. During that period, we were reading Toshimasa Suzuki's Philosophy of Retail. So later, we wanted to invest in convenience stores. It's actually like a time machine, something that exists all over the world. You see, we have all of these in China, and today we've reached a point where in the past we used to follow your lead, but now this generation of Chinese companies is actually running neck and neck with them. In fact, we've reached a stage where we have the opportunity to surpass them. I especially love reading the biographies of the founders of these big companies, or for example, the founder of Marriott. Look at how thick this book is. I remember it's 500 pages. 20 years ago, people were wondering, who is the Marriott Hotel King of China? But if you think about it today and you look at GQ's books, which everyone is reading, if GQ is the Marriott of China, then are we now on page 100, 200, or 300? Those global brands we once looked up to, at this very moment, we already have their Chinese counterparts. But today, they may still need to go through the semifinals and finals to truly stand out and ultimately become one. That makes us feel, wow, this is truly a brand we genuinely recognize and feel proud of in our hearts. I think we are living in just such an era.
I completely agree. When I founded the Digipont, I told them that what you are writing is the voice of future brand founders in the present. I've always wanted to look at things from the perspective of coming back from the future. When you were at GenBridge Capital, how did you choose your initial investment targets or the rounds you wanted to invest in? I think it's pretty daunting because putting myself in that position, going from being an employee to becoming an entrepreneur, actually requires a lot of mindset shifts. How did you take that very first step? The moral obligations among entrepreneurs of the same generation.
Looking back, that period was actually a particularly good time, 2016, 10 years ago, because the transformation of the underlying infrastructure we just mentioned was happening right then. If it had been a little earlier, you would have had to look at those offline models and you'd find that there really wasn't that much change. If it had been a bit later, like today, you'd have to wait. Like if you started your business in 2019, everyone would be doing Douyin live streaming. This generation of social e-commerce like Xiaohongshu, at that point in time, what we did was to become experts in Tmall, going through each category one by one, turning over every stone to see who was already doing something different there. Companies like Xiudaotian, Yeswood, Botare, Peli. Back then, these companies had almost no resources. They relied entirely on themselves. They had ideas and were willing to work hard. They all worked hard together like this. I remember once we gathered the founders of our brands to reminisce about the early days, and it turned out that around 2011 to 2013, many people first started by running an agency business, selling other people's products. Then they started to think, hey, why can't I make my own products? At that point, you had to think about sourcing goods, finding factories, and getting started with all these things, and then connecting with those channels. Back then, each of them had a little Jinbei van.
Yes, Jinbei, that's right.
They had to drive around delivering goods themselves. We met that group of founders and we understood why they were so impressive back then and what key experiences they had accumulated. That made them different. So at that time, we bravely placed some bets, but we were still very selective. We had a standard, which was that we were especially willing to be someone's first investor. Even though many people were looking at the consumer sector at that time, there were very few using this approach. We wanted to be their first investor. We also hope to hold a relatively large share. In many companies, we have 10% or even 15%. On one hand, this is, well, a chance to make money in the future. But on the other hand, it also represents a kind of recognition and responsibility, because in all the ups and downs that followed, it meant that you had to truly be in the same boat with them, overcoming difficulties together. So we are really grateful that at that time, many founders gave us the opportunity to sit in the co-pilot seat and embark on this journey together.
I think your investment approach is also a bit different from others. For example, the categories you invest in are all quite simple and down to earth, like rice and tissue, but the perspectives you take are completely different from everyone else's. I asked my colleagues if there were any interesting points, and they said, for instance, Mr. Chang would observe the person closely. For example, the founder of Xiudaotian would carry a rice bucket to inspect the rice. Can you tell us specifically what aspects you pay attention to when observing them? What are the points that move you both rationally and emotionally to invest in this founder?
Their growth truly reflects the saying, birds of a feather flock together in this era. It's like opening up a new territory. Previously, all the brands were already online. Everything was set up and ready. But suddenly, a few new retail channels emerged here. When you step in, you actually have the chance to carve out your own territory. It just depends on how much you can claim. Take today, for example, look at Daotian. You might say that before this, there were already very large companies in China producing rice, even if you're talking about Wuchang rice. There are definitely dozens of rice factories in Wuchang, and yet this is still an outsider coming in. So how much territory you can seize in this space really depends on your own abilities. Looking back today, in fact, both Daotian and Yeswood managed to carve out their own share. Category level opportunities are like Yeswood. It's as if I managed to seize the entire category of panel furniture and make it as popular as solid wood furniture, because after that, others can only focus on branding or go into niche segments. Back then, they were definitely not the only ones in the game, but the reason they succeeded is very important. Actually, it's on the supply side, because everyone knows how to drive traffic. That's a capability on the demand side. But in this area, it's hard to create significant differentiation. So when we were evaluating this group of people, the main thing we looked at was whether you could really rise to the next level. What are you doing upstream in the industry? For example, take Daotian. Their family has been milling rice for decades. So what they do is when they go to collect rice, they don't just wait in their own factory for the rice to be delivered. They go out to each and every household in the villages to check the quality of your rice, and only if it's good will they buy it. That's how they ensure high quality. After they became successful on JD.com, they took 200,000 RMB to Beijing to start their business. In fact, it only took them 6 or 7 years to build a business worth 1 billion, with an annual profit of 100 million. After making this money, they started buying extremely advanced machinery and equipment. I only found out when I visited, they all bought a Swiss rice milling machine called Bola. Actually, that machine can even be used to grind lipstick, so it has to be extremely precise. They purchased this kind of equipment to make the rice milling process highly efficient, allowing them to make significant investments in this area. Then, the logistics system they've built enables freshly milled rice to be shipped to JD.com's 7 major warehouses nationwide within 3 days. For example, during a recent 618 promotion, consumers who buy rice might actually receive rice that was just milled. The rice you get might have been milled just 10 or 15 days ago. When you taste this rice, the aroma is truly different. Only then can the unique qualities of the product really be experienced, making people think, wow, how is this product? And what could this brand be? That's what I saw at the time. They have to do a tremendous amount of work on the supply side in order to truly differentiate their product. And product differentiation is actually a crucial foundation for us when it comes to building a brand later on. Back in the day, I thought when we studied at business school, wasn't everyone just talking about the 4 Ps? It seems so simple: product, price, promotion, place. But in reality, once you're actually in the industry, you realize that even just the product aspect is incredibly complex and ever-changing, with so many intricacies involved. While everyone else was focused on analyzing traffic metrics, we were more willing to look at the supply side to see what was actually happening within the category. In the end, we truly witnessed the industrial upgrades and changes, as well as the continuous iteration and upgrading of our own traffic metrics. Once these elements resonated together, it actually provided us for the first time with the foundation to build a scalable brand business.
First of all, I completely agree. We also noticed that many new consumer brands later went back to strengthen their supply chains and set up factories, only to discover that there are several huge mountains to climb. But in reality, those who are very strong on the industrial side also face a huge mountain when it comes to building a brand or moving into front-end sales. This is why many people are only good at OEM manufacturing. So, how did Daotian manage it? For example, his subconscious instinct or comfort zone was actually to resonate with others. He didn't really need to come out and sell rice directly. So how did he come up with the idea to go directly onto JD.com to sell rice?
This is actually a particularly interesting story. When they first came to Beijing, they really did open a stall at the wholesale market. They were really selling rice by the bag, just a few bags at a time. Later, his wife, who was particularly perceptive, noticed that there was someone who would come every day to buy 3, 5, 10, or even 20 bags of rice. She kept chatting with this person, trying to get information, and said, "Hey, you don't seem like such a big customer, but you come every day and keep buying more and more." She asked, "What are you doing with all this rice?" After a long conversation, she finally found out that at that time, there was a company called JD.com, which originally sold 3C digital products, but now they were starting to sell daily necessities. She realized this was a new sales channel and thought, why don't we just go ahead and register ourselves there? As for the brand, at that time, he chose one called Shiyue Daotian and another called Chaihuo Dayuan. Today, if you sell rice through this channel and you only sell the same rice as you do offline, actually the logistics and other costs online are quite high. So he thought, you see, in Northeast China, we actually have even better rice in China. It's even better than the regular whole grain rice we usually buy at supermarkets or wet markets. The top tier is called Changlixiang, a long grain fragrant rice. And the best variety of this rice is called Daohuaxiang, which is grown specifically in Wuchang, Heilongjiang. Maybe about 10 years ago, people started to realize, oh, this might be even better rice. All of these are more expensive than the 1 or 2 yuan per jin rice we used to get at the supermarket. He said, let's focus on making this higher quality rice. Actually, if you think about it, what was JD.com doing at that time? What JD.com was doing was bringing China's classes online. I want to spend a bit more money to buy better rice, but actually there wasn't that much supply available. On the shelves of Walmart and similar stores, you actually rarely see these upgraded single products. And even if there are many brands, most of them can't afford to do it. The entire distribution chain is very long. JD.com has already gathered so many better consumers and their demands here. JD.com can also deliver for a long period of time. When consumers buy rice, they don't really think, I'm buying Shiyue Daotian, but rather they're just buying one of the top 3 ranked brands on JD.com. Then you see there are 1 million reviews and most of them are positive. At this point, they gradually build the core of their brand, and in this way, they manage to sell a lot. In fact, later on, many investors would say, oh, how come I've never heard of your brand? We often reply, well, go home and ask your wife. And when they do, they realize, oh, our family has actually been eating this for many years. Actually, there were many brands from that generation. With the development of distribution channels, we already had a lot of sales, but we hadn't yet achieved consumer awareness, right? But in reality, they already had a particularly solid foundation. They had already taken a leading position in this category.
Because actually, as you mentioned earlier, whether it's retail or category, it's all about the logic of things of a kind come together. In fact, I'm catching up on this lesson today, but we haven't yet entered a new era, which is about people grouping together by type. Is this why we met halfway up the mountain? I'm studying the lesson on categories. When did you start moving towards focusing on groups of people? At what moment did you notice this change? And what are your thoughts now?
It was actually because of something Doris said last year that I made up my mind to reach out to Doris after listening to every episode of Doris's podcast and clearing them all. At that time, you were talking about things of a kind come together and people group by type. What we saw back then was that after the online platform infrastructure was established, everyone could compete by category. So what was the result after those 7 years? Everyone achieved the scale they wanted, and we already have several companies. Look, in less than 10 short years, everyone is doing 5 billion, and the first original brands have already surpassed 10 billion. So from the perspective of scaling up, they've all achieved it. But then, what is the next challenge? It seems there's a term called strong, meaning after you get big, you face a problem. Why is it that no one is making money? For example, look at 3 Squirrels. Since 2019, they've reached 10 billion, and others have also hit 10 billion, but last year they did over 10 billion in business. The profit was 50 million, but they paid out 1.3 billion to all the channels. Right? So everyone is actually answering the question, I have scale now, but doesn't scale naturally mean you can make money? Why am I not making any? You can still make money because later on, when you get listed in the consumer sector and everything gets connected, you have to answer the question about profit, about that profit. Later, we understood that profit comes from 2 things, 2 sources. First, you have to ask the consumer. Only if the consumer recognizes and likes you today, will you possibly have a bit more bargaining power. The second is whether you have profit depends on your competitors and the platforms behind your competitors. Whether or not they let you have any profit, so you have to solve this problem. When it comes to this kind of cutthroat competition, how can you actually make a profit? And even if you do have profit, you see that many of our companies today can go public in Hong Kong. But for these companies, most of them are just internet celebrity platforms rather than having built a real brand. It's not like they've gained recognition from consumers or anything like that. It seems like no one has really found that feeling. It's like we don't attract like-minded people. We've already done all the work that needs to be done, but how can I make it bigger? How can I make it stronger? How can I make this company last longer? In the end, what we really want is for the brand to truly win people's genuine recognition. So this is something we need to understand. At this point in time, maybe these companies also need to move up to the next level. Because in the past, your success might have come from your business model or your industry, but today, you really have to connect with consumers to achieve greater value. So, as you mentioned about audience segmentation, in fact, every brand now needs to start learning how to connect with consumers and create greater value for them. This was my biggest breakthrough last year.
Just listening to your life story just now. Your original workplace environment actually shaped who you are today and contributed to your achievements. Of course, along the way, your strong curiosity also played a big role, leading to your success in the era of birds of a feather flock together. Now, in this era of people grouped by communities, we are facing a brand new challenge. Ahead of us is uncharted territory. Everyone is holding hands, and in front of us is a vast, seemingly beautiful future. Right now, it's a time for breaking the mold, isn't it?
Just like you said earlier, that's why I say at the core, it's still about being a small-town test taker. You might even say, if asked this question 20 years ago, like, does China have this, where's Chinese healthcare? Where's China's IKEA? When you try to figure it out, you do come up with an answer, but after you solve it, you still feel lost. Actually, in the past couple of years, as you just mentioned with Oreo and also things like Kinder Surprise eggs, although this batch of products has been very successful, it still raises a question. Are these really the products that best meet the needs of Chinese people? What we see here is actually something about Chinese multinational companies. Why is it that in the past couple of years, we've had this fighting spirit, this feeling that we have to take down the strong ones? Haven't you ever specifically researched products for Chinese consumers? Or have your product formulas not been improved for so many years? So now we've reached a point where we've finally passed the test and can compete with you on equal footing. But then, when we answer further, we have to switch perspectives. Simply copying others definitely won't work anymore. I have to answer the question of who I am myself. So this might be the current stage of brand development where we see everyone's subjectivity. You've achieved scale, you've got the profits, you've even gone public, right? Today you have a market value of 10 billion. And then what? That's why I say that today's consumer groups are becoming more discerning, and there's another major change happening in this era that we feel is the biggest shift. It's about the real decision-making and consumption. In the past, when there was still an overall shortage of supply in China, we always said it was the supply side that called the shots. But in the past 2 years, it has become increasingly clear that now it's the consumers who are making the choices. It's about my right to vote. That's even more important. In other words, as a manufacturing powerhouse, China has long stopped lacking goods. But when I first read your articles, I was especially struck by something. When faced with so many products, what I actually want was actually in short supply. So at this point today, the real question our creativity needs to answer is, if I follow the established path, everything is already there. So who am I? What else can I do? And if I really ask myself deep down, what can I offer to consumers? Product and user value for money. That's what defines a new generation. So lately, when I observe founders, if your answer today is still just, I want to build a very big and great company, I want to go public, that's no longer enough. If you're not thinking about what kind of value you want to provide to consumers and what kind of brand you ultimately want to build, then when these questions arise, they might actually guide us into the future. A newer question for entrepreneurship over the next 10 or 20 years.
This is really interesting because that so-called meeting halfway up the mountain, well, the first person I met was Dr. Kong because he came from the organizational side, and then I was in the marketing world, so we also met up for a bit. It's because he has a dream, which is to create a new generation of business education that leads organizations with a new sense of aesthetics. And then when the two of us met, it was a bit different because when you arrived, we drew a diagram. On the left was the supply side of the supply chain, which is actually what everyone used to focus on. On the supply chain side, it's either about improving the infrastructure or further enhancing the technological elements. On the right is the user side, and actually, we've never really had true DTC in China. In fact, DTC should be bidirectional. There have still been many changes in the retail channels in between. So, for example, when shifting from Tmall to Douyin and Xiaohongshu, you have to create a penetrating content layer that wraps around the product. But actually, in the past, we didn't talk much about brands. It was more about the product. I focused on making my core product bigger, and then I started to think, hey, it seems like there's no parent brand. Someone once told me an analogy that I found really interesting. He said a brand is like a folder. When you have a lot of client files, in the end, you need a folder to pull them all together. So up to now, what we need to discuss is fundamentally, what are the real needs of consumers and what is your current answer to that?
In the past few years, our exploration has been about truly maturing with the consumer and treating this as the fundamental essence. Honestly, when I look back on how I used to view these businesses, including the perspective of the original founders, everyone is really driven by this. If you ask people why they are doing this, why aim to grow bigger and stronger? We often say that we are making products for consumers. Aren't all of us in this new generation of consumer brands starting businesses using the infrastructure provided by today's platforms? If you ask about one thing, at the very beginning, the product definitely took the consumer into consideration. But today, many people, should you adapt to the traffic logic of doing or not? Should you do it or not? And later, when many of our brands say they have to keep trying, in reality, they are completely handing over their choices to the logic of traffic. In doing so, you actually lose your own agency. So at this point, when we look back at the evolution of brands along the way, it gives us an opportunity to re-examine the value of users. In the past 2 years, everyone has definitely felt that business is tough. There are so many brands and so much competition. It feels like iterations are happening daily, right? Yesterday, there was another viral copywriting, so you have to quickly follow suit. It seems like everyone is doing it, and the core logic of consumption has many constants. So when we look at it, we feel that consumer value really comes down to just a few things. First is performance, whether the product is good or not, and whether the price is worth it. For example, convenience. Is the delivery fast or not? Then there's emotion, whether I love it or not. These factors need to be combined and weighed together, and we constantly use them to make choices. In what we call the new consumption over the past period, there are actually two things that are certain: price and convenience. These are things you absolutely have to deliver. If you use all these new platforms of our generation, your products will definitely have a higher cost-performance ratio. So many platforms have already been developed, from the early days when JD.com could deliver in 2 to 4 days to today's 30-minute delivery. All channels have to be covered. In the end, it's the consumer who chooses you, right? So these two things are absolutely necessary. But when it comes to consumer pricing today, if you say we can really rely on consumer choice alone, actually the real test for founders is that as an elective, their ability to combine performance and emotion are also differentiated here. I remember back then you talked about how even headphones could be differentiated, right? Noise canceling for running, for sleeping. These are all examples of this kind of differentiation. So now what we need to look at most is how to bring together use value, functional value, and emotional value to create a great combination that ultimately not only gives consumers an excellent experience, but also fulfills many of their emotional needs.
Let me share with you my recent understanding of emotional value and spiritual value. I find it quite interesting. First of all, I think emotional value is the first step, and then comes spiritual value. And nowadays we talk about the T-shaped economy, which is about upstairs consumption and downstairs consumption. I was just about to post an article saying that downstairs consumption will increasingly care about the emotional value of dopamine, while upstairs consumption will pay more and more attention to the spiritual value of endorphins. When I attended your event at the end of last year, you introduced this model, and anyway, I ended up adopting it for myself. I think the be do have model is really excellent because it perfectly explains everything. The consumption preferences across the 3 tiers of consumption are actually completely different. Starting from what we just discussed, this variety of good choices, the quality to price ratio here is actually very good. It has the functional value at the have level. And then that do tier you mentioned at the time, I thought it was just great. The first thing it explains is the scenario, and corn from Shiyue Dao Tian as an example of operations. It's like a Pilates instructor telling you that if you eat an ear of corn from Shayu Dao Chen in the morning, you'll be able to happily wear a little summer dress. This do tier perfectly explains the emotional aspect of this matter, so you need to add a bit of sweetness. It's a bit like how men want to smoke a cigarette when they're taking a break. You need a little bit of sweetness in your daily life. That's why there's milk tea. In my view, all of these are just daily little treats. Recently, I've been working on some global expansion projects for brands, right? That day, I met a white guy friend. He was wearing that Aura ring, and both of us were wearing RingCon, right? Or maybe it's called RingCon anyway. I just feel like paying $7 a month for that is unnecessary. I asked, why pay $7 a month for this? He told me that in the US right now, society is basically divided into just 2 groups, the rich and the poor. He said, if you're not wealthy, then you're broke. And then he said, the main thing for wealthy people now is something called being, or maybe it's tier B. He said, what is this year's aspiration? It's that besides having money, you also need to have enough time and energy to take good care of yourself. For example, in the US now, there's a top-tier club, apart from regular clubs, called a social wellness club. Inside, it's filled with things like meditation, Pilates, Legree, and also longevity practices like cold plunges at low temperatures. These are some of the details aimed at helping you live longer. Basically, wearing that ring means that not only do you not need to worry about money, but you also have the energy and time to take good care of your body, your energy, and your energy management. So this is the symbol of your identity. This is how I explain why people don't wear LV or Prada anymore. Started to wear the Rao. The video I just made a couple of days ago actually talks about how the flaunting standards of wealthy people have changed. In the end, the reason why everyone started wearing Lululemon is actually a kind of inner fulfillment and spirit. That's what it really is. Your greatest capital for showing off actually supports this principle. In other words, in the end, being the most competitive is the ultimate competition.
Let me recall the previous part for a moment. For example, after experiencing that confusion, to put it plainly, it's when a brand needs to upgrade. The have-do-be model really is an especially concise framework. Have is about what you have, right? Do is about what kind of tasks I can help you solve with the product, right? Maybe even better, what other problems can I help you solve? The higher level above that is actually brands. The core of brand is really about what kind of person you make me feel like I am. I truly believe that for Chinese brands as a whole, once we can operate at the have layer and the be layer just with this simple model, everyone can open a new chapter. Here, I need to share two of my own impressions. In fact, I've only recently been working on this B layer myself. I even went to France specifically to listen to the French talk about it. Actually, French and Italian brands, they always have to ask themselves, why am I doing this today, right? Their system of symbols, their communication system. Oh, so that's how their B layer is expressed. You realize that, in fact, consumers are actually connecting with them in this way. This kind of connection has always been happening in China. It's just that today, the LV and Hermès we like, if you trace it back 200 years, it's Napoleon's Eugénie de Montijo. The trunks behind her carriage were LV. So many brands around the world create an image for people, so now we are catching up with you all. Even countries like the United States have to go to Europe and circle around. In the end, what everyone wants is a sense of identity and belonging to feel a bit like others do. The symbols that are given to you, well, I think this is already happening in China today. In fact, we are now creating our own version of this. Just like we discussed before, I think Songmont in the past 2 years has really been something that we as consumers have built ourselves. It was chosen by us. If you look at it from the job to be done perspective, today as a founder, you might want to create a functional computer bag. Later on, you might say it can have many features, but the most important thing is that moment when he kept saying, my hometown is in Shaanxi. In Shaanxi, we have the Yellow River, river pebbles, these eaves, and all these cultural symbols. So seeing this actually after I went to France and listened to their so-called brand methodology, when I came back and looked at some of the brands around us, I felt that we have already emerged. You could say that nowadays, more and more middle-aged women with taste and personality are no longer buying LV or Hermès bags that cost 20 or 30,000 yuan. Instead, they might be choosing a Songmont that costs 2 or 3,000 yuan. Actually, it's just about having a better connection with myself. Today, with our Chinese culture, if I don't play polo, why should I wear something with a polo logo? However, nowadays, in certain specific categories, we can already see that our brands are starting to make some efforts. So in fact, now is also the time for us in China to work on reaching the B level. At this time, the infrastructure is also in place, as well as our current founders, so I think the expectations of our consumers have also reached this point. This echoes what you mentioned earlier about upstairs consumption. I think the timing is just right. In fact, if we look back, this might have been much more difficult in the past 10 years. Another thing is, as you mentioned about downstairs consumption, emotional value is also part of this. This is an especially important point, and I think it's something that even I myself or people in the past have often overlooked. I have a pretty significant lesson in my life, which is Pinduoduo. 10 years ago, when we were discussing and commenting on JD.com, I said, what's so great about it, right? You go in and look at it. Last time they sold it for 9.9 yuan with free shipping, and we said it was targeting the 5th tier consumer group. What I couldn't stand the most at the time was that when Pinduoduo went public, they actually wrote that they were Costco plus Disney. I said, as someone who does consumer research, how could you do this? At first, I thought maybe I just didn't understand Costco. But looking back today, we still misunderstood Pinduoduo at that time. Just look at the Shinpinmu they're doing now. Actually, he said that at every level, he's looking for the most cost-effective products at that price point, right? The first time he said that actually, I can find happiness in every 9.9 yuan purchase. Later on, it shifted, but actually there is happiness. Even happiness that doesn't need to come from those blind boxes. Those blind boxes bring happiness, but can I get happiness just from spending 9.9 yuan? So that's what I thought at the time. In fact, later on, Pinduoduo even surpassed JD.com, at least to some extent. What's really important about Alibaba is that it not only provided more product choices for mainstream Chinese market enterprises today, but also brought happiness. The same thing happened when Snack is Busy and we visited that store. At first glance, I thought this is just a discount store, right? But then when we talk about this, when the founder of Snack is Busy, Yan Zhou, is present, I can see it in his eyes. He always talks about one thing in particular, and honestly, I haven't fully grasped it myself. I think maybe this time, during that long interview he did, he kept emphasizing one thing, happiness. When consumers come to my store, even though it's just a 100 square meter shop, they can actually find happiness here. With 2,000 choices, there are so many things here that you haven't seen before. Plus, the way they sell things, you can often buy just 1 or 2 items for 1, 2, or 3 yuan each. When you pick out single items, you can easily spend half a day just picking things out, and then when you check out, 8, 10, even 20 items, and it only costs you a couple dozen yuan. How happy does that make you? This is the kind of happiness that comes from a temporary sense of freedom. And in the beginning, Mr. Ye would even talk about other people. When I serve people in China who earn a monthly income of 3,000 yuan and they come here today, they can experience this temporary freedom of choice. Plus, there's even Jay Chu as a brand ambassador here. This is happiness. And that's not all. Later, he spent a few months in Changsha running Snack is Big and Snack is Spicy. And this year, before May Day, Mr. Yan himself set up a snack kingdom in a spot in Changsha that even broke a Guinness World Record. It covered more than 12,000 square meters in total, bringing together all kinds of snacks you could imagine. In fact, it took me years to truly understand that this is exactly what 3,000 yuan, a typical income for the mainstream in China, means. On the contrary, many of our previous commercial ventures failed to notice these people. There was nothing specifically prepared for them. So why has this type of business model been able to shift so quickly today? It's that I truly see you and start organizing things based on your needs. And even though each time you only spend 20 or 30 yuan, I'm still talking about happiness inside. So I feel like I'm giving you happiness for free. Today, brands like Mixu Cheng and Shewang also bring you emotional value. So I think this is also the emotional layer we've added. And this business, from Pinduoduo to Snack is Busy, and then to Mixway Bingcheng, I feel like, just as you mentioned earlier, can we also add happiness to basic consumption?
Hey, let me discuss this with you. Let's dive deeper into this topic. Mr. Chang was influenced by me to attend Mr. Jin's class. There's a concept here that I really agree with, which is the idea of moving from knowing to doing. Actually, there's a huge gap between the two. I've always thought I was pretty smart, but I feel like my body is numb. So in the past couple of years, I've been working on this, like after understanding a concept, what do I desperately want to do next? What is this all about? Let me ask you a question. Think about it for a moment. I want to ask, what is the source of your daily happiness? Let me share mine with you first. I used to be someone who didn't like giving gifts to others. I thought it was a hassle, so I would arrange for someone else to do it. He would say, go arrange it. Because to understand and evaluate this matter, well, my previous boyfriend once told me, when you give someone a gift and they're happy, doesn't that make you happy too? I said, oh, so this is the value of these little gestures. That's why last time I gave you a Taurus phone case. I felt like, oh, this is a connection between us. Then he said, at the moment you use it, you'll think of me. Ah, that kind of feeling. So that's the first thing I wanted to say about how to provide value to others. The second thing is that I've now learned how to find little moments of joy even when I'm busy. I think you're probably like me, the kind of person who's always been driven by tests. Since childhood, I've had this competitive spirit, like we had to get into Peking University, or I wanted to get into Fudan or study abroad in an American university, so I've always persevered. It's like, until that very moment, I absolutely refuse to let myself go. I just keep holding on. Now I've learned, when they realize I've disappeared, it's because I'm off to the side doing something like getting a massage or something, or playing with a few balls. So I'm always looking for what you'd call my source of happiness. That's my fountain of joy. So I really want to ask you, have you found your happiness?
So this really was thanks to Doris, who kept listening to podcasts. Weren't they all about branding? But then there was this one, Mr. Jin, who was part of it. And I remember you even had an episode specifically talking about your own changes. I remember it so clearly. I was listening to it on a flight, and as soon as the plane landed, I turned on my phone and sent you a WeChat message. I said, wow, what you talked about was really great. Then I asked, hey, what is this course? You recommended it, and it really opened up a new path for me. The thing I needed to get rid of was exactly what you mentioned, the source. Along the way, we've been chasing a sense of achievement, but if you really ask yourself honestly, actually, in the past few years, consumption and consumer investment have been pretty tough. People still say, wow, you seem to have a lot of energy. But truly nurturing yourself deep down is just about doing what you're meant to do, and it feels really great, right? Are these things today on a large scale, right? It comes from the joy of winning. Winning in China, how does that feel? Winning in the new generation, right? For you all over these 20 years, it's all been the happiness that comes from winning. But today, is it possible that there's another kind of happiness? Like for us, the kind of happiness from being a small town test taker after winning, because winning in the end is always very rational. When I say winning, it's ultimately about how many Weibo followers today, right? How much profit, what's the market value, that kind of thing. If you don't have that, or with the economic challenges of the past 2 years, you'd feel like, this won't work. But in these past 2 years, we suddenly realized, there's actually another world out there. I think we've all encountered the same problem. In order to get things done, we used to push efficiency to the absolute limit. We drove ourselves crazy and definitely drove the people around us crazy too. So when you look back, you definitely end up not liking this kind of specific approach, and you won't end up liking these kinds of relationships. So how do you break free from it? I think looking back, I'm truly grateful, including Teacher Jin and Teacher Lai. It's really about starting to learn all over again here. Connection, right? Connection with yourself and connection with others. Actually, this process is also about not making ourselves so regulated. We're all in our own race cars, right? How can we find the value in what we do today online? More importantly, I'm also starting to experience what our own first times are like. I still can't clearly articulate what exactly will come out of it, but gradually it might come from better relationships with family and friends around me. And also, the things we want to do might bring us better opportunities. For example, with founders, it used to feel like they just wanted to take our money, then hurry up and leave, and as soon as possible, turn that money back into returns for us. But thinking about it now, it's a purely monetary relationship, isn't it? Once we encounter some affirmation, actually over the past few years, there have been many challenges. Now, I find myself thinking about how to pay attention to that moment, what the founder is really thinking, what their emotions are. They must also feel very disappointed. They are also very confused. How can we truly see them, understand them, and stand together with them to solve this problem? Later, I realized that as long as we can do this, those other investors we used to think were competing with us for the founder, actually they're not. In fact, if you really look at it from a different perspective, it turns out that we and the founder are actually working together as one. It's a very meaningful thing. Just having this feeling along the way to today is already happiness enough. Actually, I believe it's the same with all of you, with everyone here. I remember you also mentioned that being with some founders is incredibly fortunate, right? Perhaps in the end you might ask, will they definitely become the most popular today? Will they definitely the most succeed? Not necessarily, but today, indeed, just as you mentioned earlier, I think with us and Xiu Daotian as well as several other founders, it's that kind of journey we've walked together all the way. We all understand what we're doing. We've accomplished things that no one else believed in. And today we will definitely still encounter those kinds of things. They're the kind of people who will come to us to discuss things when something comes up. And we're also willing to face tougher challenges together with founders like this. Right now, we probably have about 10 or a dozen such people. I feel that being able to meet these people along the way, just that alone, is enough for today. This podcast is really great. I don't think you've ever recorded a podcast like this before, right? One that captures a lifetime of striving and maturity. Actually, looking back now, when we used to position ourselves with a mission and vision, to become China's new generation of consumer champions, being a champion still means you want to win. So today we're thinking, is it possible for us to upgrade our mission and vision? Because deep down, you still want to win. But in the end, have we really seen the underlying risks? What consumers and users actually see is all the things we've done today, whether it's about providing emotional value or meeting essential needs with good value for money. In the end, it's all the same thing. What we all see is this group of Chinese consumers. How can they truly enjoy your product, at least feel comfortable with it in their daily lives, right? They feel reassured, and it really makes them feel like it connects them to a better version of themselves. This is truly a wonderful thing.
I've noticed that after your awakening, it seems like the so-called awakening has also brought changes to GenBridge, and that there have also been transformations during this process, right?
Yes, this year marks our 10th year of entrepreneurship. Looking back, that feeling I just mentioned is actually not just about us, your changes, my changes, and I feel that the entire generation of Chinese entrepreneurs is actually undergoing a transformation. About 10 or 20 years ago, there was a bit of a copy to China trend. Others had already gone through these stages, so what they're doing today is already very good. Then we should be able to solve this problem ourselves, so we've been working on this all along, always trying to catch up. Today, if you look at various industries, why do multinational brands have to sell to someone else? If you keep going like this, you just can't compete anymore because our brands and businesses are already on par with yours. If you don't learn our approach, if you don't learn from us, you might not be able to continue today, but after we arrived here, we surpassed those we couldn't originally, and we can say we learned from them. However, today we've reached this point, and everyone must be thinking, I believe, today. Douyin is something that has never appeared before in the history of global marketing, a platform that can combine both sales expenses and advertising marketing expenses together. This kind of platform is truly a phenomenon. You realize that the existing theories can't really explain it well. In the past, we would take your stories and bring them to China, or we would buy a brand and bring it to China. But now, can we, right here in China, directly drawing from the 5,000 years of our own historical heritage, create something that is connected by the meaning of our own brand? So I feel that when we've reached this point, it's already a birth, something unique. I believe that the group of founders we've seen recently and the hardware products we can create today are globally leading because we immediately integrate new features in AI from the start. So with this technology, how do we infuse it with meaning? Delivering this to global consumers means we need to start by leading in performance. We need to see if we can deliver something unique, just like how today Chinese electric vehicles are already the best. So today, how can I make people around the world feel happiness right now? That's why today's entrepreneurs no longer need to think, as we did before, that we have to first become the Starbucks or McDonald's of China. That's not the case anymore. Today, when we rise, we can simply be ourselves. So when we regain this sense of subjectivity, we can keep moving forward, and the road ahead will only get broader. As I just mentioned, the changes at GenBridge this year, at this moment, for all of us, really come down to two things. First, we truly need to identify what our North Star is, and ultimately, it's still about making the consumer our true goal. Second, it's about our imitation. Imitation may be a means, but after we've done it today, we have to return to that point and ask ourselves with a sense of subjectivity, who am I? Where do I want to go? What kind of different self do I want to become? I believe this is the transformation that our generation, the post-80s, needs to start making here. And today, perhaps the younger post-90s and post-2000s are already answering this question as they come up. That's why I am very optimistic about the future of Chinese brands and the consumer business. When we step up, we definitely have the opportunity to beat the whole world.
Finally, let me ask you something I haven't asked anyone else. Something about tacit understanding. I asked him if the current you could go back to Alxa back then, to the young Robert by your side. So from today's Robert to young Robert, what would you say to the young Robert now?
The current today's Robert might say to that young Robert, you can still do better, just let go.
I like this question. So what do you think the young Robert would say to today's Robert?
He might say, luckily, I still have that real thing inside me.
Oh, I really like this one.
难道失败就永远翻不了身？谁来挽救坠落的灵魂？每次一见到你，心里好平静，就像一只蝴蝶飞过废墟。我又能活下去，我又找回勇气。像氧气帮忙我呼吸，我又能呼吸，我又能呼吸，你就是不愿意放弃。生命中充满乱七八糟的问题，像走在没有出口的那个迷宫里。Oh no， 一次又一次只会用借口逃避，怎么你从来没 对我彻底的死心。我用好的很难值得你珍惜，为何你对我有求必应？每次一想到你像雨过天晴，看见一只蝴蝶飞过飞去，是那么的美丽，就像一个奇迹，让我从高下的地方站起。只要一靠近你就觉得安心，你看着我的眼没有怀疑，你对我的相信让我勇敢重生，不管世界多